It's my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce this evening's plenary speaker, Dr. Russell Moore. My name is Reverend Benjamin Johnson, Father Ben. I'm a senior editor here at the Acton Institute. Dealing with our new focus on transatlantic issues, I write primarily for Religion and Liberty Transatlantic, focusing on how to build a free and virtuous society in the United States, Canada, and in Europe. For many of those areas, and you have any interest in writing, please see me before the end of this time when you matriculate from Acton University. I hope that you've enjoyed your first full day of Acton University, and I have great confidence you'll enjoy your second full evening here at Acton University 2017. Dr. Russell Moore, our plenary speaker, is the 8th president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Committee of the Southern Baptist Convention, the nation's largest Protestant denomination. His predecessor at ERLC is here with us as well, Dr. Richard Land. Truly, we have an abundance of riches at Acton University. Before assuming his role at ERLC in 2013, Dr. Moore served as provost of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, where he also taught theology and ethics. He got one of his degrees from that university as well. He got his BS in political science from the University of Southern Mississippi, his MDiv from New Orleans Theological Seminary, his PhD from that institution, the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He and his wife, Maria, have 5 boys, making her a candidate for sainthood in any denomination. 2 of whom are adopted. When asked which one are his, he says, all 5 of them. They all eat here, I pay all of the bills. His focus on the fact that all of his children are his own helps us remember how our Heavenly Father sees us. All of us different, and yet all of us as adopted children. So thankful for his focus on that. His passion for believing that all of us are adopted children of God was recently on display at the Southern Baptist Convention, from which he has just come, where he was a passionate advocate for a new resolution condemning racism. That resolution reads in part, "We denounce and repudiate white supremacy and every form of racial and ethnic hatred as of the devil. We earnestly pray both for those who advocate racist ideologies and those who are thereby deceived, that they may see their error through the light of the gospel, repent of these hatreds, and come to know the peace and love of Christ through redeemed fellowship in the kingdom of God, which is established from every nation, tribe, people, and language." On behalf of all colorblind Christians across every sector of God's gracious and wonderful church militant, thank you and God bless you. Dr. Moore, in addition to his passionate advocacy for racial reconciliation, continues the Southern Baptist Convention's historic concerns of religious liberty, freedom of conscience, and how to shine the light of the gospel in the public square, all of these great concerns of the Acton Institute. He will share these with us at this time. Please welcome Dr. Russell Moore.
Thank you, Father. Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here at Acton University, and thank you, Father, for that kind introduction. I often tell people that I'm a product of evangelicals and Catholics together, and by that I don't mean the 1994 document. I mean my mother was a Roman Catholic, and my father was a Baptist pastor's son, so I'm literally a product of an evangelical and Catholic together. So it is very good to be in the room with folks from many different communions. There's an old Texan who doesn't agree with me on many of the issues we'll be talking about tonight, but who said several years ago a line that I think of very often. He said, "Everyone wants theocracy, and everyone wants to be Theo." And I think that has proven itself over and over again throughout human history, and is proving itself over and over again now, as we have many who will argue for a kind of theocracy who do not even recognize a theistic being, but who nonetheless want to impose an ideology upon the consciences of others. When we think about these issues of religious liberty, one of the things that I've found as I'm talking to people who disagree with the viewpoints that most of us in this room would hold, what I find is that many of them do not have a clearly thought out agenda of destroying religious liberty or freedom of conscience or the freedom of churches and synagogues and other religious institutions to function. What I found is that many of them simply do not have a category to understand what it means to be motivated by religious conscience, who don't understand what it would mean for someone to say, I must one day appear before the judgment seat of Christ, or to understand what it would mean for a group of nuns to say, if we were to pay for abortion-causing drugs, we would be violating our conscience and we would stand accountable to our God. They simply don't understand what these motivations are like, and so many of them assume that when we talk about religious freedom, when we talk about liberty of conscience, what we're really after is a kind of power move. What we're really up to is some sort of political agenda or some sort of economic agenda. The Little Sisters of the Poor want to save money on insurance, or others want to simply use religious liberty as a way to oppress others or to discriminate against others. I think the challenge for us as we go into the next 10, 20, 30 years on issues of religious liberty is not simply going to be legislative protection and judicial protection, although all of those things are very important. I think we have a task of communicating externally and internally when it comes to issues of religious freedom and liberty of conscience. Externally, the primary issue that we will have is communicating not simply the freedom to believe, but what in fact we believe, what it means for us to be religiously motivated people of conscience. And then internally, cultivating a sense in our own religious communities of why religious liberty matters, why this isn't simply a social issue, a political issue, a cultural issue, but is actually grounded in the very things that we believe. One of the things that I will sometimes encounter with Christians is the question of, well, if religious liberty matters so much, why don't we have a lot of detailed instruction on religious liberty in the New Testament? And I will often say it's the same reason that there was not instruction on sexual ethics to eunuchs in the New Testament. There's no reason for it. The New Testament church has no political power, has no cultural status, and so the New Testament church is existing over and against a state. New Testament church doesn't have the responsibility of statecraft or the power of statecraft. But what we do have is a message that comes in the Scriptures talking about the priority of the conscience, talking about the limits of the state. And in reality, when we deal with these issues of religious liberty, just as when you're dealing with many of the other issues that you're going to be talking about this week, about economic liberty and various other forms of freedom, what we're really dealing with is the fundamental question, is the state God? And so in order to communicate why we believe in religious liberty and why we believe in freedom of conscience for everyone, there are several things that we've got to work on. First of those things, I think, is the very nature of the conscience. One of the problems that we have in American life right now is a polarized body politic that wants to use the levers of the state in order to win on every issue. And so there is an underlying assumption that majoritarianism is always the way to settle every issue. And so we cannot coexist with one another. Someone must win. someone must dominate, and someone must win completely. And there are even those who would say the religions in American society, such as my own, that hold to exclusive truth claims cannot, in fact, coexist with people who disagree. That is not the case. As a matter of fact, those religions that maintain exclusive truth claims are actually the groups that are best able to articulate religious liberty and freedom of conscience for all people and not just for ourselves. For me, as an evangelical Christian, the primary reason that I believe in religious liberty is not because of the First Amendment. The primary reason I believe in religious liberty is because of John 3:16. I believe that the gospel, if it is coerced politically or culturally, is not a gospel at all. The state cannot turn people into Christians or Jews or Muslims or Hindus. The state can only turn people into pretend Christians, pretend Jews, pretend Muslims, pretend Hindus, if in fact religion is a matter of internal transformation, of commitment of oneself. And one of the opportunities that we have in a secularizing American culture is an understanding of religion that forces our religions and our religious communities to define ourselves, to understand who in fact we are. In my tradition of Bible Belt evangelicalism, there are many places in the country where a form of evangelicalism for many years has been a kind of de facto state church. People needed to be a part of a church in order to be seen as a good person, not to be able to answer the question, what are you religiously, with I'm a Baptist or I'm a Methodist or I'm a Catholic, would be essentially, for most of the 20th century, the equivalent of saying I'm a communist sympathizer, or I'm not a good American, I'm a godless person, I'm not a good person. That's changing. It does not alarm me when I see rising numbers of Americans identifying themselves as having no religious affiliation. I don't think we necessarily have more atheists and agnostics in American life. I think we have more honest atheists and agnostics in American life. That does not bother me because a cultural imposition, and certainly a political or state imposition of a religious identity, is in fact no religious identity at all. As an evangelical Christian, I believe the way that we reach our neighbors with the truth of the gospel is not with power, but with the open proclamation of the truth, with the persuasive appeal of the things that we believe, the things that we hold to. If evangelism is simply a matter of power, simply a matter of who has the most power at the moment, then the evangelism doesn't line up with what the scriptures define as religion in the sight of God. And a majoritarian understanding of political power as a means of religious coercion, whether that is in a theocracy imposing a religious identity, as we see in many parts of the world with blasphemy laws and laws against conversion, or with a state that is imposing a secularist and secularizing ideology that says that religious conviction and religious conscience is not welcome in the public square. These mechanisms of power are not only wrong, these mechanisms of power are self-defeating. So one of the things that we must say to our secular neighbors who have no religious conviction at all is to say, using the power of the state, thus using the power of the threat of the sword, in order to accomplish your religious goals, even if your religious goal is the eradication of explicit religious belief and behavior ultimately will be turned against you. And we must say, within our religious communities, the temptation to use the power of the state in order to coerce people and their consciences not only is wrong in terms of our responsibilities to our neighbors, but also will be handing a sword to Caesar that will ultimately be turned against us. We must teach what it means to have a conscience that is free in a way that makes it very clear what we do not mean by that is that all truth claims are relative. What we mean is that the state is not the referee between those truth claims. We teach about the nature of the conscience. We also, though, need to maintain the freedom of the mediating institutions. I had someone say to me not long ago, talking about the efforts happening right now in the public square, coalitions of Catholics and evangelicals and Jews and others for religious freedom. He said, I just think we need to ultimately get off of defense and move on to offense. And what he meant by defense is religious freedom. But advocacy for religious freedom is not a passive and defensive move. One can only think that if one assumes what is really important is what the state does. If we understand, though, that the most important things in our lives are actually not the things governed by the state, not the things defined by power politics, then we will understand religious freedom is itself an act of offense in freeing people to debate, to dialogue, to seek to persuade each other of their religious truth claims. And we're able then to see past current events and current controversies in order to say religious freedom is about giving to us the power to have honest disagreements. I was on a panel several years ago with a Muslim woman along with a representative from the ACLU and a Unitarian Universalist minister talking about issues of church and state and religious liberty. It was a lively discussion. And at one point I said, I think that religious liberty is about giving the space in the public arena where my friend here can seek to persuade me that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. And I can seek to persuade her that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to the Father except through him. Question and answer time came, and a college student came to the microphone and said, I can't believe that you would say something as arrogant as what you just said, in which you said that you would seek to persuade her to become a Christian. Because why can't you just say, we both worship the same God, we both have the same religion, we just express it in different ways. Why in the world would you seek to impose your religion upon her? I turned to my Muslim friend and said, do you think that we share the same religion? She said, explain your religion in a sentence. And I said, the eternal God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and the Son of God has become incarnate in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, crucified for sinners and raised from the dead. She said, no, we do not share the same religion. At which point I turned to the college student and said, why do you want to impose your religion on us? That was one thing when we were dealing with a college student and a microphone on a university campus. It's quite another thing when we see the exact same mentality happening from a United States senator from Vermont questioning a nominee for office on the basis of his theological convictions. We must understand what it means to communicate to our neighbors that the state does not settle every issue, and that there are some issues that are too important for state adjudication. And one of those issues would be the claims that we make about the most ultimate matters in life. We work to create churches and communities that are able to see the fact that they are free precisely because they are in every conceivable way more important than the current political structures and institutions. If we believe the things that we say, that means that we understand that these religious communities are not just temporary gatherings of people who happen to share the same opinions, but actually a sign to the outside world that there are issues that are more ultimate and more important, and that consciences cannot be dictated to by that power. That leads to the third thing. We need to understand and to teach both internally and externally the importance of the limits of the state. Many of you in this room have been talking about that over the past several days, and Acton has been working on that for these many years in multiple arenas, one of those being the economic arena. The issue here of liberty of conscience and the issue here of the freedom of houses of worship and freedom of religious people to operate according to their convictions ultimately is about that. Whether or not the state will put upon itself the power to decide everything. And a state that can pave over the consciences of people who believe that they will be accountable to their God is a state that can do anything. One of the ways that we teach that and instruct that is by teaching the centrality, for those of us who are Christians, of the church itself. The most important passage for me in the New Testament on religious liberty actually is in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where the Apostle Paul says to the church there at Corinth, when I tell you not to associate with the sexually immoral, I am not referring to the immoral of this world, or the swindlers, or the robbers, because in order to do that, you would have to go out of the world. I'm saying do not associate with one by the name of brother, because I don't judge the world, I judge those who are within the church. There is a clear delineation here between the realm of the church, the issues that are interrogated by the church, and the power that the church does not have over the rest of the world. Unfortunately, often, at least in American Christianity, we want to do the opposite. We want to rail against those who are on the outside, atheists and secularists and those who are immoral people, and say nothing about the things that are happening within the body. So as the Guardian newspaper in the United Kingdom put it, American Christianity has the persistent temptation to anathematize the sins that least tempt its members and to ignore or even sanctify the sins that most tempt its members. We have seen that bearing itself out truthfully over and over and over again. When we, though, teach our communities the difference between the sort of accountability that we owe to one another within our religious communities from the kind of persuasive conversation that we have with those who are on the outside, we are communicating to our own people the difference between government power, strictly limited, and the power of the persuasive nature of the gospel itself. That is a really difficult lesson to teach in an American society that is robbed of transcendence in such a way that people find in their political movements not just a way to accomplish things for the common good, but a sense of identity, a sense of belonging, a sense of even transcendence, so that arguing on Facebook becomes a kind of sacramental act in American life. You're dealing with the issues that seem to be the most important at the time. We, though, have the opportunity to cultivate with our children an understanding of the limits of the power of government, so that we communicate there are all sorts of things that should be legal that are wrong, and all sorts of things that are wrong that should be legal. And the government doesn't have the competence to judge true worship from false worship. So that when a government says it's not that much money, colonial era Baptists, to apply for a license to preach, the response is the issue isn't how much money, the issue is who has the authority to demand it. And when the Department of Health and Human Services says it isn't that difficult for you, nuns, to simply fill out the forms activating the power of the state in providing these contraceptive drugs and devices, the issue isn't how much time it takes to fill out the form. The issue is who has the power to demand that of the consciences. When we raise up the next generation to care about religious liberty for all people, we're doing so not just because we don't want to be persecuted, but because we do not want to be persecutors. If we refuse to speak on issues of freedom of conscience and religious liberty, and say, as some would, seeming very spiritual, let's simply abandon the table, then what we are doing is putting into place precedents and practices that will bind future generations' consciences as well. That is not the responsibility that we have been given. That is not what a republic is for. And so within our religious bodies, we have all sorts of arguments that we ought to be ready to make in the public arena about religious liberty. We have all sorts of arguments that we ought to be prepared to make in the courts. We have all sorts of pieces of legislation that we ought to long for and work for. But those things will only do good if we have religious communities who know what they believe, will articulate and advocate for what they believe, and will say to the state, we will stand with this whatever the consequences. Because the state assumes that you and I are going to move on whatever list of issues they have, and that the power of the state will just move us along a little bit quicker than we would go to end up where we would ordinarily be in the progressive march of history. We have to be the people who raise up a generation that is able to say, you do not have the authority to pave over and bind the conscience. We will work to see to it that you don't. But even if you do use the power of the state against us, we will still stand here, because there is something more important than Caesar. Caesar is not God. Thank you.
You're not going to get away that easy.
Okay.
Before we get to these questions that are coming from our audience, I'll practice the moderator's prerogative. Do you find in the years that you've been in the job you're in a rising concern and desire to understand better and act, or reluctance to engage, just hopefully it'll go away, among congregations?
Yeah, I find a rising concern, but often a concern about the wrong things. And so one of the biggest questions that I will get from evangelical congregations is, what can we do to make sure that the government isn't going to force us to, say, perform marriages that we don't believe are actually marriages? And the response to that is to say, I just don't foresee in American life anytime soon the government doing that. That's not the question.
Right.
The question is about, for instance, these institutions that are religious institutions one step out from the church. So right. Adoption agencies and universities and colleges and those sorts of questions. Often I find that people in congregations aren't very familiar with that. And the other thing is, I find that there are many people, at least in evangelical congregations, who have intuitions about religious liberty, but they don't know how to articulate those things. Right. So that it sometimes sounds as though religious liberty is simply a method of self-protection. Right. Rather than what it actually is, which is working for the common good, not just our own interest.
No, exactly. I fear that until people learn and think about it better, the way you articulated it so well, it's not happening to me, but if it happens to somebody I know or whatever, then I get more involved or right. concerned. Right. Well, we have a lot of questions, absolutely a lot of questions, and we'll do as many as we can. And remember, we are giving the questions based upon what's come from you and what's voted up. So once I ask it, quit trying to vote to get it up again. It's there. Okay. Should Satanists have religious liberty?
Yes.
I don't think it's a trick question. I think they really want to know.
Yes, precisely because I want to know who Satanists are. In order to evangelize them with the gospel of Jesus Christ.
I thought you were going somewhere else. Yeah.
I do not want Satanists pretending to be Christians
right.
In American society. Religious liberty always has limits, as any liberty or freedom does. So I'm not for the liberty of Satanists to commit human sacrifices sure. or those sorts of things. But I do want people to honestly express what it is that they believe, even when I find those beliefs abhorrent. That doesn't mean that stops the conversation. Right. It means that I'm going to say Satanism is morally and spiritually repugnant and will send you to hell. I just don't want a bureaucrat coming in and making you pretend to agree with me right. on those things.
Right. Close to this question and very related, I'll just go ahead and ask you to add a little bit. What would be examples of limits to religious liberty beyond something like human sacrifice? And how would you decide that?
Well, I think the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993 does a very good job at setting the parameters of what that ought to look like. But obviously, there are all sorts of parameters here where you have danger to other people. So, for instance, human sacrifice. I can't say that I have the religious liberty to embezzle money because my religious texts tell me to. But it does mean that the government has to have a very good reason in order to limit my religious freedom, just as they have to have a very good reason to limit my freedom of speech. And they have to demonstrate that they're using the least restrictive means to do right. that. I think Religious Freedom Restoration Act did a very good job in defining that. And one of the things that's most troubling to me right now is the fact that in 1993, when RFRA was passed, my predecessor, Richard Land, in the room, was very active, one of the key figures in passing that. And it was a coalition that went from our organization all the way over to the ACLU. Right. Religious liberty was not a partisan issue or an ideological issue. Now we're at a point in time when the ACLU is actually working against RFRA. That's, I think, a dangerous place to be in American life.
Yeah. How should we respond to old guard culture warriors who seem to be prioritizing political power while neglecting the formation and recognition of virtue? I don't know about that old guard. That's a little insulting, but okay.
Well, I think the issue is not necessarily responding to anyone. I think the issue is making sure that we're carrying out our responsibilities within our local congregations, which means catechesis is very important in all of our religious communities. One of the things that was absolutely pivotal in my life was the fact that I was living in a religious community where I had on a Sunday morning, Sunday school, worship service, something that was called training union.
I remember that.
Which was a night sort of class teaching you through the things that we believe, evening worship, a Wednesday night class dealing with missions and so forth. There was a rhythm in the week that was devoted to making sure that by the time we graduated from high school, we firmly knew what it is that we believe. Now, there were many people who could walk away from that, but they knew what they were walking away from. We're in a time right now where you look at religious communities of almost every kind, and when you do surveys and say, are you a regular churchgoer? Once you dig in to those numbers, you find out that people are defining regular church-going as once a month.
Right.
It is impossible or virtually impossible to catechize people in any group of doctrines 12 times a year for an hour.
And I think this information became more prominent to a lot of people and surprised a lot of people because of the way people started counting who's voting for Trump, who's voting for Cruz, and all that. Until that came out, well, what do you really mean church-going? People weren't focusing on that, and I think it's changed the way a lot of people do these studies.
Yeah.
Okay. Does religious liberty necessitate that the state be neutral, or can we recover a sense of the state privileging Judeo-Christianity in civic life?
Well, I don't want the state privileging any theological position. I do want the state being formed and shaped by certain principles, and many of those principles are coming out of Judaism and Christianity. Right. But I certainly don't want the state coming in and taking as a state a theological or religious character, because I think all that does is turn these important and eternal truths into just another state program. Right. And a government bureaucracy has shown itself not to do a good job with all sorts of things, certainly doesn't do a good job.
And it doesn't change that fact, even if people are elected by the people, they're still turning it into something else. Yeah. The state decides who is a child's legal parent. We and our opponents have different views on this. The state can't be neutral. How does religious liberty help?
In terms of the state deciding who someone's legal parent is?
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, if I understand what it is the person's getting at, that's one of the reasons why often I will have fellow evangelicals who will say, why do we care about having all of these debates and conversations about marriage, for instance, or about family, when in reality, let's just take a consistently libertarian approach that would say the state has no interest in these issues at all. And my response is to say the state has to have an interest in issues of marriage and family, because the state has to decide who is responsible for children. And out of marriage, as historically conceived, there's the possibility of children. So there is a state interest that is there. So the idea that if we just created complete government neutrality on questions of divorce or so forth, then we would avoid our culture wars. I just don't think it's possible.
What is the biggest hindrance to religious freedom in the U.S. today?
I think the biggest hindrance to religious freedom in the U.S. today is what I mentioned earlier, a misunderstanding of what religion is. From groups of people who are separated and segregated from one another, so that many very secular people don't have any contact with genuinely religious people, or if they do, they don't have contact in which there is an explanation of what it means to be a religiously motivated person. And so you add to that this ideology that says that culture and society is always progressively moving towards some Hegelian goal. Then you end up with people who ultimately think often that religion shouldn't be outlawed, but religion is antiquated, religion is on its way out, religion is going to go away, and we're just going to help you get there. When in reality, that's just not the way that human beings function. Never has been the way that human beings function. And as you look around the world right now, if one only looks at Western Europe and North America, one would have one perspective on religion. But if one looks at the entire world right now, the idea that religion is evaporating is absurd.
Right. Should the Christian church preemptively refuse to participate in the civil side of marriage?
I don't think so. I know there are Christians who disagree with me on this. I have very close pastor friends who won't sign marriage licenses now because they will say the state has a different definition of marriage than they do. I think until the state attempts to define marriages performed within a congregation in a way that violates the teaching of that congregation, I think that we ought to continue to sign marriage licenses and participate in that, because we do understand that the state has a role. State doesn't have the ultimate role in marriage. There are all sorts of things in marriage that the state can't and shouldn't decide. So, for instance, I mean, one of the most controversial things that I ever do is to say to a couple asking me to officiate at their wedding that they can't write their own vows. And you will have couples who will just be completely offended by that. And my response is to say, yeah, but this wedding isn't about you. This wedding is about this community of witnesses holding you to your vows that you make to one another, and you don't know what you ought to vow to one another right now. That's why you need this community around you. So it's not just a celebration of your love. I don't want the state to decide that. But nor do I want the state coming in and saying you have to marry whoever comes to you. We're a long way from that, and so I think we do recognize the state does have an interest in holding people to their commitments in a way that isn't predatory upon one another and upon children. And so I'm fine with signing documents.
What do you say about defending our beliefs through censorship? I find many Christians want to legislate their beliefs. Any thoughts?
I really I would love to know what the person sees as examples of that happening. I don't find a lot of Christians in American life right now who are wanting to censor other people in American life or to use the coercive power of the state to advance Christianity or whatever the religion is. I just don't see that happening right now. I just had this conversation yesterday in Washington with a group of people who were completely on the other side of me on everything, really. But this was one of those things who said, you know, why are you all coming in with this culture war, religious liberty crusade? And my response was to say, you know, there are things that you could rightly accuse us of coming in with some sort of culture war preemptive attack on you. Religious liberty is not one of those things, because in every single instance, what you have are people who are not wanting to impose their theological beliefs on other people, but are simply wanting the right to exist. Right. When Catholic adoption agencies in Massachusetts are saying, not, we want to decide who other adoption agencies will place in what homes, but to say, we want the ability to actually be Catholic as an adoption agency. And the state says, then that means you must go out of business because you can't have a license. That's not religious people attempting to use religious liberty as some sort of a wedge issue. That is a purely defensive move of religious people saying we want to be able to be religious.
In your interactions with people who hold these views, do you feel like you are talking to people who know better? They do understand what you're saying, but they are pretending to argue something else because that's where their side is on the argument? Or do we have a situation like we do on college campuses where we have both students and faculty who really don't seem to understand the right of free speech? It just doesn't occur to them that other people have a right of free speech.
I don't think we have people who are lying about what they believe, but what I do think is that often we have people who are able to recognize basic principles of religious liberty when it applies to a group that they clearly recognize as a religious minority. So if they're talking about the Amish, or they're talking about some other clearly marginalized, clearly persecuted group within American life, they understand principles of religious liberty and freedom of conscience. But when they think about Catholicism and evangelicalism and so forth, what I find is they typically assume that this is the dominating sort of force in American
Power structure
life.
and all of that.
Yeah, which is just absurd, really, when one looks at the reality in American life right now. Now, were there times when that was the case? Yes. I mean, my ancestors had to walk out into the wilderness in New England because they were persecuted by a Puritan state church. That's not the reality that we have in 21st century American life. But I think there's an assumption that that's the case. And so, and there's also the assumption that people who are advocating religious liberty are in fact lying. And I mean, the conversation as recently as yesterday, someone who said, you all talk about religious liberty, but you don't really believe it. What you want to do is to oppress other people within American life. Well, that's certainly not the case for most of us who are advocating religious liberty. And I think one of the ways that we have to make that clear is to be consistent in our application of religious liberty. Make it very clear, we're not just talking about some sort of a carve-out for ourselves. We don't want some sort of theological welfare from the government. What we want is the ability for all people to freely exercise their religious beliefs.
Right. How do we work to persuade those religious individuals who do believe that their religion has a call for them to use the legal system to enforce their own religious rules? So I think this is from someone who says, for those who believe the legal system should be used, go on the offense, use it. How do we persuade them of that?
Well, I think there's a difference between people who have consciences that are motivated by religion in order to work for the common good, and people who seek to impose their theology or their church structure upon other people. Sometimes there are some gray areas there where we may disagree on those things, but for the most part, we have an understanding there where those things are different. So someone who would say, I am motivated by my religious convictions to care for immigrant communities, and therefore I don't want the government saying that a church can't minister to immigrant communities. I'm motivated by my understanding of what the Scripture teaches about this, is not seeking to impose a religious definition upon the state. Just as when I'm working with a radical feminist group on sex trafficking issues, I'm motivated by my understanding that the women who are being trafficked here are created in the image of God and are infinitely valuable to God. This person may be motivated by the fact that she's wanting to fight against the patriarchy, and she sees this as an example of that. We have a commonality in what we're doing, but we have two different sets of motivation there. So I wouldn't say, well, no, let's not address sex trafficking because you're religiously motivated, you're imposing your religion. But I also wouldn't want the government coming in and mandating that all of us oppose sex trafficking because we believe in the Imago Dei. Right. You know, there's a difference there.
Right. Is this, we're getting closer to the eventual Benedict option question, I bet.
Yeah.
Is the precipitous chipping away of religious liberty a reversible trend, or should we prepare for an inevitable period of serious persecution?
I do think, I do not have a gloom and doom sort of approach to religious liberty issues. I kind of take the approach of the Grateful Dead in their song A Touch of Grey. It's even worse than it appears, but it's all right. Which is to say, I think there are things going on in American life that are worse than most people see or recognize and know, but we also have seen in American life, we've tended to be able to get our balance. Mm-hmm. And so what I want to do is not to say to people, persecution is coming for you. But what I do want is to cultivate people within congregations who are able to take on persecution if it does come.
Right.
And that's frankly true in any generation of the church.
Do you think the election of President Trump represents a thoughtful approach to this, or more politics, and it doesn't necessarily mean a bunch of people have decided we should stand up for this?
Well, I think there's a multitude of reasons why people voted in the various ways that they voted in American life. But I do think that there were many evangelicals and Catholics and others who voted for President Trump because they saw the sorts of things that had been going on through the judiciary over the past 8 years. And so, including people who didn't resonate with President Trump on a variety of other issues. And so what I would hope would happen out of that is that we would have both of the parties in American life understanding this, so that the Republicans would say, we really need to make sure that we're actively working for religious liberty for everyone. And the Democrats would say, we need to understand that the approach that we took with a Solicitor General in Hosanna Tabor arguing against the idea of churches being able to hire their own ministers, right, or Solicitor General mentioning the fact that the government may take away tax exemption from religious institutions on the basis of their views of marriage, that is an overreach that isn't going to be received by the American people.
You made me think of the mayor of Houston demanding pastors submit their sermons. It's a tone deafness.
I honestly, when the mayor of Houston subpoenaed the sermons of pastors, I was told about this by text message from a church member of mine, and I assumed, oh, somebody's been on Facebook reading some wild conspiracy thing. There is no way that this is happening. Yeah. And then to find out that is actually happening was shocking, as you mentioned, not only because it's a violation of the most basic First Amendment understandings that we have, but also because it's such a politically dumb thing to do. Right. And so in doing that, she actually was able to mobilize people together who haven't been able to work together on anything. Right. In my denomination, we have had a controversy that has gone on for the past 50 years between the right and the left within Baptist life, ending in a fracture of two different communions and groups. And we all were in agreement on this, right, able to sign a letter together. And so I just said, nobody else has been able to unite Baptists in America like the mayor of Houston.
Absolutely. So, well, and it makes me think of this earlier question because I don't think that the mayor is a stupid person.
Right.
And her aides, I haven't met them, but I can't believe no one was around and said, oh, whoa, wait a minute, we can't do this. Even if you want to do it, it's politically stupid. And, that's what's scary to me is the lack of awareness about what a lot of this looks like. If you said to people before that nuns would be told you're going to do abortifacients, I mean, people would have just laughed.
Oh,
it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But they brought themselves to that position, and it's a dangerous thing for one party to be so tone deaf about this or hostile. Most millennials supported the senator from Vermont in the recent election. How do we communicate the good of liberty to the leaders of tomorrow?
Well, I think we do it in multiple ways. I mean, one of those ways is to take the places where people already agree with us about basic American principles and basic conscience issues, and then demonstrate how all of this connects together. And then within our own particular communities, making sure that we have people who understand these things. I'm not so much worried about what an atheist, secularist millennial thinks about religious liberty, although as an American, I want to persuade that person, as I am someone who's sitting in my own pew, in my own evangelical congregation, who thinks this ultimately doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Because if you have religious people who aren't willing to speak and to stand up for freedom of conscience, then you then remove the last stop in American life against this stuff.
How hopeful would you be that there are, let's assume there's this category of millennials or younger voters, and they did vote for Senator Sanders in large numbers? What is it that could persuade them to listen to people who make this argument and maybe even say, okay, I get that?
Well, I mean, I'm no Bernie Sanders apologist, but I actually think if you look at the Bernie Sanders-Hillary Clinton dichotomy, Bernie Sanders actually wasn't concentrating on these sort of culture war, social issues. Never during the campaign do I remember him addressing religious liberty issues.
Oh, he had economic five-year plans.
It was economic. Yeah, it was all economic. Secretary Clinton did. I mean, she's talking to groups in ways that were very explicitly dealing with religious liberty issues. And so I would think that what the Democratic Party ought to learn from the fact that this septuagenarian socialist came really, really close, relatively speaking, to winning the nomination, is to say maybe sort of left culture war identity politics isn't necessarily even going to work among our own people. I would hope that that would be one of the conclusions that they would come to.
Yeah. Wouldn't religious liberty require the state to acknowledge a higher law than the Constitution and a higher interpretive body other than the Supreme Court?
Yes, in the sense that the Constitution already does, or at least that the American project already does, in saying that the state is not ultimate. Now, the state does not come in and catechize people on the nature of God or who God is, but the state certainly does say that the state is not ultimate, that there's a higher sense of accountability.
Here's a very specific and easy one. What about instances where parents deny necessary medical treatment for a child based on religious convictions?
Well, I think that that's not an easy question to answer, because that could be so broad as to mean should the state force a parent to provide Plan B contraception to a teenager, in which case I would say no, all the way over to should the state intervene when it comes to the life of a child being imperiled, in which case I would say yes. And so the state does have an interest in protecting the life of a child. Those two liberties are coming into conflict, and the state has an interest there, absolutely.
We communicate insight on ethical issues. Now, did you just erase my question, Dan, before I could finish it? There it is. We communicate insight on ethical issues in quotable sound bites. Does this obscure the fact that ethical reflection is hard and the responsibility of everyone?
Yes. What I think we need to be doing is making sure not that we have a list of ethical answers to this list of ethical questions, but that we're shaping and forming moral intuitions that are then going to be able to take on ethical issues in the future. Right. So I think of, if one looks back at the early 1970s in my own evangelical community, at the reaction to Roe versus Wade, Christianity Today celebrated Roe versus Wade. Some of the most conservative pastors and leaders in my own denomination welcomed Roe versus Wade. It wasn't because they had an abortion rights ideology or because they understood the Constitution to have penumbras upon emanations upon whatever. It's because you had people who had not had to think about those sorts of bioethical questions and who weren't ready when an abortion culture hit them. And so evangelicals lagged behind Roman Catholics on this issue for quite a while. I think there are all sorts of other issues that we're not thinking about right now. And so one of the things I try to say to my students and to pastors in my circle is to say, really the most important and the most dangerous cultural questions and ethical questions that your congregation will face are not the things being debated on Facebook right now. They're the things that people are not talking about at all because they're not, they've either already accommodated to those things culturally or because they don't see what is happening in the culture around them. So I think of years ago, I was driving through Indiana and I stopped at a gas station and was filling up my car, and I looked across the street and there was this big gathering of people, looked like a block party. And I said to the person next to me, "What's going on over there?" And he said, "Well, that's an adult video store. It's opened up here, and the people in the community don't like it. And so what they've done is they've gone over there and they're taking pictures of all of the license plates of the cars that come, and they're posting it at the general store in the town square, and they're going to try to run that adult video store out of business." Well, good for them. But I think about that all the time because
That should work.
Yeah, maybe it did. But what they didn't know is that right around the corner was a digital revolution that was going to make pornography not only nearly ubiquitous, but also was going to give pornography the sense of anonymity, where someone doesn't have to make the decision, I'm going to be the kind of person who will drive into this video store and get out of my car. And so there was just a tsunami headed for them that they couldn't hold back. I think there are all sorts of other issues taking place around us right now that we're not ready for. So in my own neighborhood, my kids are the only kids in the neighborhood who don't have iPhones. And my kids come to the dinner table and said, "Why are we the only people in the neighborhood who don't have iPhones?" And I said, "Well, we love you. We want to cultivate these sorts of things in you. We don't think this is good for you." Then I had to deal with the fact that I have one of my sons who's kind of like me, a recovering Pharisee, who went to the neighbors, the kids in the neighborhood, and said, "It's really sad that your parents don't love you." No, not what I'm saying. But what is happening is that we have a lot of people, it's not that they have decided, we think this technology is okay and acceptable for our children at their stage of development. It's that they don't even question. Of course they're going to have an iPhone because everyone that they know has an iPhone. I had a woman who came to me because I work in adoption and orphan care a lot. She adopted a child a little bit older. He was 11 years old. He was addicted to internet pornography. And she said, it's a compulsion. She said, it doesn't matter what sort of filter we put on our computer, he can get around it. We don't know what to do. And I said, okay, well, here's the first thing. I said, let's get the computer out of your house completely for right now while we deal with this. And she laughed at me. And she said, well, obviously we can't get the computer out of the house. She said, there's no way to. I said, well, I can show you how to do it. We can't actually get the computer out of that. She said, well, obviously we can't do that. And I said, people made it for thousands of years without internet access. You really can do that if the choice is this situation that's destroying your child. But it wasn't even anything that was on the table because it seemed obvious. I think there are lots of issues that we face like that right now, many of them having to do with technology. Right. But when we raise them early, what tends to happen is that they seem so ridiculous and far-fetched As you mentioned, if we talked about forcing nuns to pay for contraception, we would have thought that was ridiculous a few years ago. There are all sorts of questions: artificial intelligence,
Right.
of human-animal hybrids, of all
Right.
sorts of bioethical questions that if one mentions these things right now, it would seem like ridiculous science fiction.
Right.
So.
Something you said earlier, and we talked about this in an earlier session here at Acton University, and it particularly, at least my experience, relates to evangelicals. I've grown up now with the megachurch and the seeker church and the seeker-friendly church becoming so dominant, and I've watched so little of the big social issues that have serious moral implications be talked about from the pulpit. And the question is something like, isn't it a problem when church people don't hear a very good example of a moral leader, or should be, speaking about these issues, not to turn sermons into political diatribes, but to go a year or more, ever, and never talk about the life issue, never talk about some of those big issues. How big of a problem is that? Doesn't that create a problem that we can't move any kind of policy because people don't even think about it?
Well, I think one of the problems is that in evangelical life, what we have tended to have are congregations that are completely silent about any issue that impinges on social or cultural life, and then churches that are so politicized that they are speaking about every issue with a political frame. Rather than having congregations that are seeking to shape and form the consciences of their people to be able to live within a culture and to live as citizens and so forth, that are obviously not agents of some political ideology or some political movement. They're not precinct captains for anybody, but are willing to speak to the whole range of issues that the Scripture speaks to, however that falls down politically. I think that's getting better, and some of that has to do with, you mentioned seeker-sensitive movements in evangelicalism.
Because that's the argument sometimes. Well, we won't grow the church if we scare people off with these issues.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that sort of least common denominator Christianity can only work in an ecosystem of cultural Christianity, where people think that it will do them good to go to church, or that it will do good for their children to be in church. Increasingly, that's not the case in American life. So if someone joins a church, someone is not helping himself or helping herself in terms of advancing in career or what have you. In many ways, one is incurring a cost socially and culturally, which means that the most dynamic growing churches that I know of in the evangelical movement in the United States of America today are very theologically robust churches that are upfront about what it is that they believe, and working very hard to be a sign of contradiction, as Kierkegaard would say, to the rest of the culture.
Okay. Well, let's do one more, and it takes us global. Tim Farron, was the head of the Liberal Democratic Party in the United Kingdom, resigned recently, an evangelical. Much has been written about how problematic this is for Christians because the guy was completely with his party on everything. It's just the fact that he was an evangelical and believed certain things that he wouldn't even vote for. And the question is, what does this say about the future of religious liberty in the Western world generally?
Well, it's very troubling. I mean, that's the same sort of thing I was mentioning earlier with Senator Sanders. It's the sort of thing that I face in Washington with people in various places in government all the time who will say, should we have on our church website who the deacons are, who the elders are, if that might cause these people to lose their positions, whether that's in government or at a law firm or whatever. I think the answer to that is we cannot be scared and intimidated, and so we have to be upfront about who we are as religious people. so that even if we are going to be persecuted, people know what it is that they're doing. I think of Walker Percy writing a letter to the New York Times on the abortion issue. And he said, you all will probably win this, but you can't have it both ways. I'm going to tell you what you're doing. And I think that if you have people who are self-consciously saying, this is who we are religiously, this is who we are as citizens, and if you seek to eradicate that, we're going to tell you what you're doing. I think that's an important piece of this.
I think so. Dr. Moore, thank you.
Thank you.
Join me in
Thanks
thanking
for having me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful.